We talked about cellular respiration and the fact that oxygen plays an important role in that process. But, sometimes you may wonder, well, what if there is no oxygen? What about the time where there was no oxygen on Earth and there are actually cells that can grow and function in the absence of oxygen? Those are called anaerobic molecule, but anaerobic cells or organisms, they do not need oxygen. And also the process of burning energy in our muscles can be both anaerobic and aerobic. So we can sometimes burn the glucose that we have in our body, in our muscles, without the need for an oxygen. And that usually happens when you have to run really fast for a short amount of time. Now, this process of breaking down glucose and creating ATP is called fermentation. There are two different types of fermentation. One is lactic acid fermentation. The other one is alcoholic. We're looking at lactic acid fermentation here. So in the fermentation process, since oxygen and oxidative phosphorylation is not involved, then we only are dealing with glycolysis in the beginning. So the pyruvate grooming, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain chemiosmosis do not play a role in fermentation. So what happens? Glucose, as usual, turns into 2 pyruvate molecules and 2 NADH are produced. And also we know that during glycolysis, we make 2 net ATP. So yes, a lot less ATP is made, but still some ATP is made for these cells to use. But now the cell has a problem. Well, when the cell breaks down glucose and makes pyruvate, that's nice, we get ATP, but we're getting a buildup of NADH. And since we don't have the electron transport chain to deliver these electrons to, then these are going to build up. So the way the anaerobic cells have solved that is by fermentation. And this fermentation is the step that comes after glycolysis. Now with lactic acid fermentation, pyruvate is turned into lactate or lactic acid. And then during this process, this NADH is going to turn back into NAD+, which can go back to glycolysis and then keep this process going. So basically the whole point of lactic acid fermentation, the fermentation in general, is to replenish the NAD+ that the cell needs to make ATP in the absence of oxygen. And this is actually the type of fermentation that goes on in your muscles sometimes. What about alcoholic fermentation? Well, you have glycolysis, you get pyruvate, and then during alcoholic fermentation, there is a 2-step process. There is CO2 produced. So pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon molecule. It loses one of the carbons in the form of CO2. You get acetaldehyde, and then acetaldehyde takes the electron from NADH, turns it back into NAD+, so it can go back to beginning of glycolysis and break down more glucose, and then turns this acetaldehyde into ethanol. So this is alcohol fermentation. This is what we use to make beer and wine and so on and so forth. So now, we've been talking about making ATP as a source of energy for our cells from glucose. But we don't only eat carbohydrates. We don't only eat glucose. How do we derive energy from all the other types of biological molecules that we eat, like fat molecules and protein amino acids? Well, it turns out that all those 3 types of classes of molecules, carbohydrates, amino acids, and fats, they're actually modified and fed in some step of the cellular respiration pathway. So carbohydrates, as we all know, as we've seen, are fed through glycolysis, some amino acids, and also the molecule of glycerol, which is derived from fats. They are fed into glycolysis. Fatty acids and some amino acids are modified and fed into the pyruvate oxidation pathway, and some other amino acids are fed into the citric acid cycle. So you can see that we don't only fuel our energy using carbohydrates and glucose. It's actually the cell can take advantage of all the different types of macromolecules that we ingest, and we feed it into the cellular respiration pathway. But the important thing to note is here it's all one pathway and everything goes to the same place. And this is why any biology introductory biology class you take, this process of cellular respiration is covered because it is so fundamental and essential to living beings.